Welcome to Chapter 10, Critical Thinking. This is session number 3. We're going to look at is the history of critical thinking, thought, and where did it come from, who's attributed as the founders, where did it begin. Many attribute the beginning of Western critical thinking. Now that's, again, to divide it from non-Western critical thinking because there are critical thinkers within the non-Western world that have conserved their wisdom and thoughts and knowledge for millennium. And so, but they are non-Western. So what we're looking at is, okay, if that is non-Western, where did the Western thought come from? Where did the Western critical thinking come from? It says, many attribute the beginning of Western critical thinking to Socrates and the Socratic method of questioning. He questioned everyone and everything that claimed to have reliable knowledge. Okay, so that's Socrates. And who was Socrates? Well, we know of Socrates indirectly through Plato and his writings. We know that he was a philosopher from Greece in around the 600 BC mark. And it was at the same time of that mark that Greek Western philosophy was being born. And here is from the book of The Story of Philosophy by Brian McGee. He states, the first philosophers were making two great breaks with the past simultaneously. In the first place, they were trying to understand the world by use of their reason, without appealing to religion or revelation or authority or tradition. This is the beginning of Western critical thinking. So in other words, it was critical because it was critical of the previous patterns and the previous sources of reliable knowledge. And they're breaking away. They say that they are going to understand the world by use of their reason. Okay, so that is what critical thinking is based on. Critical thinking is based on human reason. So you're using reason to criticize. You're using reason to evaluate the sources of knowledge. So they're going to understand the world by use of their reason without appealing to religion or revelation or authority or tradition. Now imagine this taking place in a non-Western context, whether you're in China or you're in Japan or you're in another non-Western country, and you've got a group of people or a small group of intellectuals that come together and they say, okay, we're starting a new path, and we're not going to appeal to religion. We're not going to appeal to revelation. We're not appealing to any authority around us or tradition. Now, how would that go over? How would that go over in a non-Western context? Whereas this was a non-Western context. Greece was a non-Western country that had all these gods, that had all this tradition, that had all this wisdom. But these guys saying, no more of them. And so what they were proposing, and what we've shown before, is there are sources of reliable knowledge today that are recognized. And there's 4 of them. And the basic 4 sources are intuitive knowledge, just means I know it. It is from within me, and somehow I know that this is true. Now, how you know it's true or how it becomes true, there might be different methods, there might be different ways, but it is not rational. It is not reasonable. It is intuitive. Just the knowledge comes. Number 2, the authoritarian knowledge, which we then look to an outside source for truth, for reliable knowledge. And that outside source is the authority and we respect that authority, and we trust that authority for leading us and giving us truth. That is number 2. Number 3 is logical knowledge or human reason. Reasonable knowledge, which means knowledge is gained through the processes of critical thinking. We look at something, we evaluate it through logic, human reasoning, and that produces reliable knowledge, is through logical human reasoning. Number 4 is empirical knowledge, which means then knowledge is only gained through experience. It's not something we're born with. It's not something innate. It's something that is observed, and it is true because I have seen it. I have touched it and felt it. So these are the 4 sources of reliable knowledge. And what the early Greeks were proposing is that number 3 is the only one that is a reliable source. Now, when you pick a reliable source, what you are saying is that the other sources are not reliable. And you have reasons for that, of expounding why. Why is intuitive not reliable? Because it's not based on reasonable processes. What about authority? Authoritarian knowledge, again, it's not subject to my reasoning, to my critical thinking, therefore it is out. Logical knowledge, yes, that's what we're based on. Empirical knowledge, well, we can accept empirical knowledge as a secondary form, but the chief part of critical thinking is thinking critically through logical knowledge. So these are the 4 accepted versions of sources of reliable knowledge. But as critical thinking goes, and as the early Greek philosophers went, they eliminated 1, 2, and 4 and went straight for number 3, which was through human reasoning. Socrates, his method of questioning all sources of knowledge led his students to question all authority, from the pantheon of gods to the local authorities. A lot of the teachers of old had schools or developed different schools of thought, and they had followers. They had disciples. And so the followers of Socrates were absorbing his method, and they were mainly younger students. And so his method of questioning knowledge led his students to question all authority. Now, this probably did not go well in a non-Western culture where at that time, even in Greece, there was authority structures, there was respect, there was a lot of different attitudes going on that would not condone this. So this was seen as a break, and that's why the book of philosophy, Brian McGee, says it was a break from the past because they're no longer respecting normal sources of reliable knowledge. They are discarding religion, authority, whatever belief system there is, and they're only going through reason. So what they're doing is he's teaching his students rebellion. He's teaching his students to disrespect what the local cultural norms expected. Led his students to question all authority, from the pantheon of gods to the local authorities themselves. So the Socratic method, which is the basis of critical thinking, was actually a method that was thought of as generating rebellion within the youth at this time. So what did his method, what kind of dispositions did his methods reflect? Well, number 1 was rational thinking, and it was self-individual, autonomous, rational thinking. Okay, it was not group thought, it was not authority structured, it was a disrespect, it was rational thinking, but individualistic. Number 2, it was open-mindedness. In other words, it was like, well, this is what the culture says it's always been. This is what's always been practiced, but I'm open to doing something different. So in other words, again, it's kind of a rebellious spirit that goes against the way it's always been done or the way it's always been practiced as part of the cultural divide. It is analytical. Okay, they're listening to truth claims and they're taking them apart one by one to show that those truth claims do not have justified reasons behind them. They are justified because of culture. They're justified because of authority. They're justified because of something other than human reasoning. So they're analytical. They're self-confident. Number 5, self again, because it's the community before, or the non-Western thinking is community driven, and it's everybody. Whereas this is now fostering a self-confidence for self-thinking, for self-governing, for self. So in other words, it's really changing not just thinking processes, but the characteristics of that is becoming self-confident. Inquisitive, which can mean doubting. It can mean curious. It can mean asking questions, which in a lot of non-Western countries is not an appropriate characteristic to be developed among students. Questioning the status quo. Again, that is not an acceptable attitude within certain cultures, within a non-Western culture. Questioning the status quo. Why do we always do it this way? Why? And it's kind of like you're asking for explanations when before the explanation was because I said so, because that's the way we've always done it. But now human reasoning is the filter and critical thinking, and so questioning of status quo, if it does not have adequate reasoning to it or reasons for it, then it's questioned or it's deconstructed. Questioning of authority. Okay, it didn't matter anymore who the authority was or who said it. Now they question everybody and everything, and this is what Socrates is teaching. Doesn't matter who is attributed to saying it or who says that it is true. Don't go by the title of who, go by what. And you take it apart, you look at it, you challenge it. How do you think that went over? Well, probably not real good. But number 9, it generates a suspicion, suspicious of knowledge claims. And so now what they're doing is anything and anybody that claims to know something or claims to have knowledge of something, he's generating a suspicion, an attitude of suspicion of saying it's probably not true. It's probably not adequate. It's probably not. And so these are the dispositions that were generated by Socrates and by his Socratic method. And these dispositions were not generally accepted within his own culture. Again, here's just a chart of taking the Socrates and his method and his dispositions and lining them up with the chart that we had seen before and how they compare, and just showing that the rational thinking, the open-mindedness, the analytical, self-confidence, inquisitive, questioning the status quo, questioning of authority, suspicious of knowledge claims, is pretty much a Western disposition, a Western mindset that did not exist, this Western mindset, until Socrates started implementing these dispositions. Socrates, he was training the young people to think rationally for themselves. question authority, and act autonomously. These attitudes were in opposition to the Greek culture at that time. But it was these attitudes that would birth the new Western culture. And that's what they're saying. Where did critical thinking come from? Where did Western philosophy come from? And most of the people indicate back to Socrates around 600 BC, with the breaking away of the different methods of attaining reliable knowledge for a non-Western culture, which was through respect and authority and conservatism, and this is the way we've done it. And Socrates is introducing a new idea, a radical change that is almost disrespectful of authority and is respectful only to each one having his autonomy, respecting his own autonomy, respecting his own opinion, respecting his own power to individually critically think. Because Socrates' disposition and practices were against the cultural norms of his day, he was arrested, and he was tried, and he was convicted. What was the trial about? Well, the verdict is Socrates is guilty. Firstly, they said, of denying the gods recognized by the state and introducing new divinities. And secondly, of corrupting the young. Because they charge him with two things. One is introducing new divinities, which is kind of odd because Socrates is introducing critical thinking, and he is saying no more authority, no more gods, no more revelation, no more church authority, no more cultural practices, no more customs, no more traditions, no more. And yet one of the first charges against him is denying the gods recognized by the state and introducing new divinities. Now, that's kind of odd. And secondly, of corrupting the young. I can see of corrupting the young in that he is in a non-Western culture that expects the young to be submissive and to learn and to absorb from the local authorities what is true, reliable knowledge. But Socrates is teaching the young to question the authority, and not just question them, but to doubt them, to suspicion that they do not know, they do not have reliable knowledge. So Socrates is being tried. He's in court. And that's what they tried him on. What they were trying him on was he is stripping the young people of the cultural norms. He's taking away the authority structure of the whole culture and putting the authority into the minds of the young people, making them autonomous, self-directed, self-empowered, and critical thinkers. Well, this is in Socrates' time. I was reading some academic journals, and I came across a quote by a Bruce Diedrich Price, and this is what he says about critical thinking today and what it seems to be achieving. And he says, after you strip away all the high-minded rhetoric, critical thinking is typically used to tell students that they should not trust conventional wisdom, tradition, religion, parents, and all that irrelevant, old-fashioned stuff. That's fascinating. I don't know if he is aware of the original quote in the book of philosophy by Brian McGee and how the original philosophers were breaking tradition from the past by not trusting conventional wisdom, not trusting tradition, not trusting religion, not trusting parents, and all that irrelevant old stuff. So this educator today is saying this is what they are teaching as critical thinking. It is a rebellion against the authority of the culture. So it kind of caught my attention, because what he is calling that they should not trust, the students are being taught not to trust conventional wisdom, tradition, religion, parents, and all that irrelevant old-fashioned stuff. Interesting in that those are the same things that the original Greek philosophers 600 BC were making a very big break from their cultural past by not trusting conventional wisdom, tradition, religion, parents, and all that irrelevant stuff. So in other words, he was processed for sedition, Socrates. He was being charged with corrupting the youth. He was being charged with introducing new divinities, which we're going to see in a minute. What in the world was that all about? But this is the same charges of what educators are bringing today of what critical thinking is doing within the school structure. Question. If Socrates' disposition and practices were against the cultural norms of his day, how did he come up with them? Where did they come from? How did he break away so sharply from tradition? And what were these new divinities, and how were the young being corrupted? So that is kind of a question. How do we come up with something new? Where does it come from? If we are bred and brought up and cultivated within the same culture, how do we break away? How does something novel and new come into our thinking processes? Now, this is the interesting part. Socrates, his ideas came from the daimonion of Socrates is the God or divine entity which inspired him all his life. Socrates himself said, "The favor of the gods has given me a marvelous gift, which has never left me since my childhood. It is a voice which, when it makes itself heard, deters me from what I am about to do and never urges me on." So how did Socrates gain new, reliable information? It was from a voice. It was from a divinity within him that he said has accompanied him since his youth, all of his life. And this voice is what directed him to what to practice and not to practice. Now, interesting thing, it says that the voice deters me from about what I'm about to do and never urges me on. So in other words, it is always a voice of deterrent, but not a voice of going forward. And that is kind of the spirit of critical thinking. Critical thinking equips the students to deconstruct, to take apart, to say and see what is wrong, but does not equip the students with the tools to put together. So in other words, we end up and have ended up with an educational system that is based on what's called deconstructivism, that deconstructs and takes apart, but leaves the students and the whole system with nothing to operate on. And this can be a very dangerous situation where we are teaching them how to deconstruct and how to take things apart, how to critically think, but we're leaving them without any knowledge, leaving them without any thoughts, leaving them without anything to build on or to hold on to, and it just becomes philosophically what has become known as deconstructivism. So where did Socrates come up with this idea? He came up with his idea from an inner voice. That's kind of odd because Socrates taught against anything that was against reason. And so, in other words, critical thinking, if it was not built on reason, if it is not built on justification by human reason, then we tear it apart. We take it down. We do not receive it. But where did Socrates get that idea from? From an inner voice. That's not reason. So in other words, where did this new thought come from that destroyed or changed and convicted him of corrupting the youth? Was from a voice that was within him. As one writer has put it, the apparent contradiction that Socrates considered in modern centuries as the paragon of objective rational thought heeded an unexplained sense that gave no logical basis for its promptings. Okay, so, and what we've seen in other chapters about knowledge, where did this knowledge come from? Where did this knowledge for this Western science come from? Where did these breakthroughs come from? From Albert Einstein, from René Descartes, from Niels Bohr, and it was often through dreams. It was through visions. It was through voices. And it's kind of like, now wait a minute, if those people are the fathers of rational thought and of putting together the whole system of filters, the scientific method that filters out what an authority may say or what intuition may say or what God may say, and have instituted human reasoning as the bar, as the filter, where did they come up with that from? They came up with that from a voice. It's kind of like an inner voice. That brings things kind of suspect as to what is going on. Is that, are we really in a empirical, rational battle, or is it spiritually based? Even though they're in science, they reject the domain of the spirit world, but yet it seems the spirit world has been very influential in building of modern day science, even up till today, of critical thinking. So again, as one writer puts it, the apparent contradiction that Socrates, considered in modern centuries as the paragon of objective rational thought, heeded an unexplained sense that gave no logical basis for its promptings, and that is what gave Socrates his ideas. Socrates is recognized as the father of Western philosophy and critical thinking, both rejecting intuition or mystical experiences as sources of reliable knowledge. Which can seem to be a contradiction, because Socrates, the founder of critical thinking, did so by teaching standards and values outside of the parameters of his time and outside of the parameters established by the filter of human reason. Critical thinking in science today is practiced to protect the same parameters. So in other words, a science has been established by consensus, but established by people that had ideas, visions, and voices that established the fact that critical thinking is to maintain that science, and that we use critical thinking to not evaluate that science, but we use critical thinking to evaluate our attitudes as we look at that science that requires methodological naturalism to function as one of the base rules. National Science Teaching Association. They say, although no single universal step-by-step scientific method captures the complexity of doing science, a number of shared values and perspectives characterize a scientific approach to understanding nature. Among these are a demand for naturalistic explanations. Okay, why are there naturalistic explanations? Because there are no spirits. There is no spirit world. There is no supernatural. And yet, a lot of the discoveries within critical thinking and in modern day science themselves have been through dreams. Sounds kind of contradictory. Sounds kind of like we are not in a war of reason or flesh and blood, but we're warring against powers, principalities, against authorities that are of a spiritual realm. The standards and values of modern day science. What are the standards and values? Well, this has been a part of other lectures, but what it is a judge's memorandum of a court case that was brought in by parents into the court system, advocating for different models of science to be taught alongside evolution. And this is the judge's response memorandum. It was Judge Jones in the Kitzmiller case, Kitzmiller versus Dover Area School District. He states, while supernatural explanations may be important and have merit, they are not a part of science. And you would think, well, yeah, because science only deals with what can be observed and what can be reasonably processed, what can be. It's kind of like, well, no, not really, because science includes a lot of things that were not observed and that are not that reasonable. So what is it? Well, it's a self-imposed convention of science which limits inquiry to testable, natural explanations about the natural world. Okay, again, a non-Westerner does not agree that there is such thing as a natural world, because you cannot separate the spirit from the matter and its influences. You can't just study matter over here and separate it and attribute all cause and effect of what happened to that matter as natural causes. That is a Western separation to even have a natural world or to describe it as natural. It says here, which limits inquiry to testable natural explanations about the natural world, is referred to by philosophers as methodological naturalism, and is sometimes referred to as the scientific method. So the scientific method is about philosophical naturalism. You have to look at the world this way. And how did they come up with that? And it's kind of like, well, some of them came up with, even Rene Descartes came up with them through dreams, which is kind of, again, contradictory. Methodological naturalism is a ground rule of science today, the judge goes on, which requires scientists to seek explanations in the world around us based upon what we can observe, test, replicate, and verify. Now, those are 4 conditions that normally can only be produced within a physical world. And so what they're saying is that these are the conditions, is that we have to observe it, we have to be able to test it, replicate it, and verify it, which means no spiritual dimension would ever or could or would submit itself to man's rules of this is what it takes. And that's why it's kind of like, okay, some of the rules have a specific reason for being there, and that is to delineate or to eliminate any of the outside forces or concepts that they do not care to deal with. Again, going back to Stephen Jay Gould and the world, the looking at the world through lenses, He says, first facts do not come to us as objective items seen in the same unambiguous way by all reasonable people. Theory, habit, prejudice, culture all influence the facts we choose to observe and the way in which we perceive them. Now, there might be even other factors. If a non-Westerner would read this, they might say, yes, theory, habit, prejudice, culture, and the spirit world all influence the facts we choose to observe and the way in which we perceive them. Session number 3, what we're looking at is, what is critical thinking? Where did it come from? It came from Western philosophy. It started in a non-Western world, in a non-Western culture. How did that begin? How did that start up when the cultural norms were by gaining reliable knowledge through this method, and yet a group comes along and says, no more religion, no more tradition, no more authority, no more, this is how we're doing it. It's kind of like, wow, how did that ever get started? How did it ever get in and break open that thought process? This is session number 3 on critical thinking. We're Tim and Holly Nyquist. If you'd like to communicate with us, you can through the addresses that are here behind me. Thank you again.